So the title of the seminar is Ethnic Conflict. And in order for us to start understanding what are the determinants of ethnic conflict and what are the ways in which scholars have explained why ethnic conflict arises, why it doesn't, we need to understand the concept of ethnicity, the concept of nation, and also what the relationship is between ethnicity and nation. And later on, I'll talk about the relationship between ethnicity and class. And I'll also draw a distinction between conflict and violence, analytically separate the two. So the concept of ethnicity has been viewed as having either a narrower construal, narrower definition, narrower interpretation, or a broader one. In the early days of the scholarship, ethnicity was basically equated with language-based communities or kinship-based communities. So, Tamils by this definition, or Kannadigas by this definition, would be ethnic groups. So would tribes be, and so would caste groupings be. Right? Because kinship is extended family network. That's the simplest way to understand that. And anthropologists, of course, will give you much more nuanced, much more technically sophisticated discussion of kinship. But for our purposes, for the purposes of this seminar, all we need to know is that kinship can be defined as an extended family network, and that's why, in a manner of speaking, not necessarily literally true, but in a manner of speaking, and therefore, in that conception, tribes, castes, and language-based groups were included under the term ethnicity. Over the last 20 to 30 years, the definition, the concept has become broader, and it has begun to include not simply tribes and castes and language, but race and religion, shared history even, and the basic rationale for making the concept broader is that when conflict arises, when conflict arises or when intensity of attachment is examined, it is not clear that human beings are necessarily more attached to a caste as opposed to a tribe, more attached to a linguistic group as opposed to a religious group, more attached to a race as opposed to common heritage. In different parts of the world, depending on context, different identity markers have been invoked, have been used for mobilization, and have generated enormous passion, unleashed enormous passion, and even violence. So, the Bangladesh versus West Pakistan, East Pakistan versus West Pakistan conflict was not based on religion. It was based on language. Hindu-Muslim conflict, essentially defined in terms of religion. Right? And the black-white conflict in America is racial, not religious, not linguistic. All of these are examples of intensity of passion and also violence that different group markers of identity, different identity cleavages can generate. So it's not clear according to this justification, according to this rationale, that we should necessarily separate ethnicity from religion. Ethnicity then becomes an umbrella term. Ethnicity and religion need to be, of course, separated. When you have a clash like East Pakistan versus West Pakistan, you have a clash like Kashmiri Hindus versus Kashmiri Muslims, they share ethnicity, Kashmiriyat, but not religion. When you have Irish Protestants and Irish Catholics clashing, they share Irishness, but not religion. When you have, as I said, black and white American Christians clashing, they share Christianity, but not race. So that's where you need to make the separation. It's necessary in some ways, but on the whole, the new concept of ethnicity is broader than narrower and includes all these forms of identity. What about nationhood? What is a nation and how is it different from ethnicity? A claim about what constitutes a nation is typically a claim about cultural distinctiveness. But it is not any such claim. It is a very special kind of claim about distinctiveness. It means, as you go through the literature as well as the rhetoric of nationalists, it means investing a cultural community with political power. So, a nation in popular usage can be defined only in cultural terms. You have, for example, the term Nation of Islam in the United States. Or you can use the term nation for all kinds of groups in India. They're a nation. But in the social sciences, there is a specific meaning attached to the term nation, and it cannot be defined without politics. It's not simply a claim about cultural distinctiveness. To use Ernest Gellner, someone we will engage quite a bit in this seminar, to use his very helpful words, a nation means building a political roof over your cultural head. Building a political roof over your cultural head. The cultural community itself can be, of course, variously defined. In terms of language, almost all European nations are linguistically defined. The prominent exception being Switzerland, which has 3 large linguistic groups: the German-speaking, the French-speaking, and the Italian-speaking. Other than Switzerland, and by some recent reckoning, Spain, all nations of Europe are linguistically defined. Race can be a basis. And here, Germanness or German nation is not only defined in terms of German speaking, even Austrians are German speaking, but they define in terms of racial ancestry or bloodline. Which was the reason why, after the Soviet Union broke up, many former Soviet people became German citizens so long as they could demonstrate that they had German blood in them. They, however, spoke Russian, not German. Demonstration of German blood was all that was necessary for acquiring citizenship and membership in the German nation. That's racially defined. What are the other racially defined nations of the world? Japan is one. And Korea also is, except that Korea is divided into North and South. So over time, it became an ideological definition, which takes us to the point, or to the question, whether ideological nations are possible, as opposed to nations defined racially, even religiously. Pakistan is religiously defined. Israel is religiously defined, though that is not how Israel began. But Israel is religiously defined. Even those who are not believers in Israel would agree that the original conception was a mixture of politics and religion. Right? Iran is religiously defined. It's the leading Shia nation of the world. Shiism is the definition of Iran. Right? Sri Lanka argues it's a Sinhala nation, a contested view. Right? Thailand argues Sri Lanka argues it's a Buddhist nation. It's a contested view. And Thailand argues it's a Buddhist nation that is also contested by Thai Muslims. 5% of Thailand. But there is a religious definition possible also of nationhood, which was not true historically, which was not true when European nations were born. This is a 20th century development. But can there be ideological nations? Nations defined in terms of ideology. The Soviet Union was defined in terms of communism. That is, of course, a well-known, very well-known example of an ideological nation, but consider the United States as well as France. In the nationalism literature, there is no doubt that these two are also ideological nations. Their nationhood is defined in terms of the ideas of the American Revolution and ideas of the French Revolution. Liberty, equality, and three other ideas are there in the American Declaration of Independence, which was the founding document for American Revolution. And France also had liberty, equality, and fraternity, the French Revolution, which essentially means that anyone can be American and anyone can be French. It is not a racial definition. It is not a religious definition. Right? Anyone can be French in principle. Anyone can be American in principle. That leads to all kinds of troubles in these two nations. But these are not linguistically defined nations, primarily. Idea of language appears again and again. But the primary definition is in terms of the key constituents of the revolutions that founded these two nations. Later on, we'll ask how India is defined. But that need not detain us right now. What does this mean in terms of the difference between ethnicity and nation? An ethnic group can live without a state of its own. For example, it can express a preference for and be satisfied with affirmative action, right? It can say 10% of jobs should be available to it. Or protection of its way of life in the existing framework. Claims about language. Claims about forms of worship. Right? So long as that is protected, an ethnic group could be pleased with the outcome. When an ethnic group claims that self-realization depends on mastery of the political domain, when it believes that its cultural realization, however cultural realization is defined, cannot be achieved without mastering the polity, without taking control of the polity, then it begins to take steps towards nationhood, though that may not necessarily happen. A national consciousness, when an ethnic group develops, it also begins to demand a state of its own. That state could either be a sovereign state, or in certain situations, certain conditions, it could stop short of that and could simply demand autonomy as opposed to sovereignty, as in a federal framework. Many federations in the world are called multinational states for this reason. Now, the two great theorists of recent times, just look at their specific definition of a nation. We have already referred to Ernest Gellner. Ernest Gellner, to make a nation means to endow a culture with its own political roof in Nations and Nationalism. We will come to whether nations can be modern or nations can be pre-modern a little later. Look at the definition by Benedict Anderson. arguably the greatest theorist of nationalism over the last 3 decades, if not longer. One might note that Benedict Anderson's Imagined Communities, the book Imagined Communities, published in 1983, is one of the highest selling social science books ever. It can be easily now established, something like this, because numbers are available. It's also among the most cited social science books ever. That can also be established through new technologies, especially Google Scholar citations. He argued that nation is, quote, an imagined political community that is sovereign and limited. The term sovereignty has already been explained to you, and it's very, very well known. And limited, the term limited here means that an imagined international community, world community, is not a nation. Right? The world is not equal to a nation. There will be many nations in the world. Why that is so is something we'll have to come to later and understand. It has something to do with modernity. Both of them have claimed, incidentally, that nations are modern entities. So when you hear a Hindu nationalist argue that India is an ancient nation, or even Jawaharlal Nehru argue in the discovery of India that India is an ancient nation, remember that social scientists do not agree with that definition. For them, nations are modern political entities.